On the wind-swept plains of Colorado, beneath a sky heavy with autumn storm clouds, Emily Parker stumbles against the weight of a curse she never deserved. They branded her unlucky, cast her aside, and sent her to a rancher as if she were nothing more than debt to be repaid. But Jack Miller is no ordinary rancher. A Marine tempered by war and silence, he watches with eyes that have seen too much, and beside him, Rex, a German shepherd with scars of his own, never strays from her shadow. One night, as thunder splits the horizon and whispers rise in town, Emily steps into the road to snatch a child from the jaws of death. In that moment, the curse shatters, and the truth begins to claw its way free. What follows is not just a battle against rumor, it is a reckoning. For faith, for love, and for a life no longer chained by lies. And sometimes, the miracles we pray for are not thunderbolts from heaven, but the quiet strength of a woman, the loyalty of a dog, and the hand of a man who chooses to believe. Chapter 1. The Woman Cast Aside. The wind slid down from the Rockies with a cruel sharpness, carrying sand and cold that scraped against the blacktop and rattled the signs that leaned at the edge of the highway. Denver shimmered faintly behind, swallowed by haze, while the Front Range stretched out like a jagged shadow. It was late afternoon, and the sky had settled into a shade of iron, warning that the night ahead would be long and bitter. The bus hummed steadily along US 85, passing weather-beaten silos and barns, through yards where old machinery rusted into silence. Inside, passengers huddled against the draft, seeping through loose windows, each carrying their own story of leaving or returning. Emily Parker sat near the rear, a woman of 34 with auburn hair pinned tightly back, pale skin dotted with a scatter of freckles, and a gaze that lingered on the glass as if the reflection itself might hold answers. Her olive-green parka had seen better winters, its fabric rubbed smooth at the elbows, and beneath it her posture carried the weight of someone who had grown used to bracing against blows she could not prevent. In her lap rested a canvas tote, worn and plain, holding all she had chosen to carry from her old life. A second-hand pair of boots one size too big, a notebook filled with half-started thoughts and someone else's forgotten grocery list, and a sealed envelope bearing the name of a man she had never seen, Jack Miller. Emily's life had been reduced to whispers and accusations, the kind of stories that take on a life of their own when repeated often enough. Her ex-husband Tyler had left quietly, without a fight, and yet the neighbors had turned her into the villain of the tale. Every misfortune that touched the family seemed to be traced back to her. The car that refused to start, the pipe that burst in their rental, the uncle who slipped on the ice, the series of unpaid bills. Her aunts shook their heads and muttered that some women were simply born unlucky, cursed to bring sorrow to the men they married. The old superstition, kak chong, a wife fated to harm her husband, was never spoken aloud, but it lived in the glances, the pursed lips, the small gatherings of relatives who pitied Tyler for what he had endured. Her parents had tired of her return after the divorce, of the way her presence drew whispers in the church foyer. Linda Parker, her mother, was a compact woman with hair dyed chestnut and lips pressed into a line that seemed permanent. She believed in order, in bills filed neatly, in reputations that must be preserved. Robert, Emily's father, had worked years as a lineman. His hands bore scars from electricity and cold, but in the household his voice carried little. His silence was more final than words, and when Linda insisted that Emily be sent away, Robert said nothing to stop it. They had arranged the job with Jack Miller like a transaction. work in exchange for lodging, her presence, removed from their home, and their reputations left clean. When the bus stopped outside a small roadside diner, Emily stepped into the raw air, her breath turning white as it fled. The diner smelled of coffee, frying batter, and the faint sting of disinfectant. She chose a corner stool, folding her hands around the chipped mug the waitress offered. In the chrome reflection of the counter, she saw herself as others might. Plain, forgettable, careful not to take up more space than needed. The door opened hard against the wind, and conversation dipped as a tall man entered. Jack Miller filled the frame with quiet weight. He was 39, 6'2", shoulders broad under a storm-gray jacket scuffed pale at the seams. His beard was 2 days old, his eyes wind-worn and set deep, the kind that had looked across distance and learned not to flinch. There was a scar at his jaw, thin as a river cut into stone, and the stillness of his movements spoke of discipline drilled into bone. 2 tours in Afghanistan, the townsfolk said, and a wildfire summer where he'd stood against flames to save what cattle he could. He carried himself not like a man seeking attention, but like one who had measured every step and chosen it. At his side trotted a German shepherd, 4 years old, coat black and tan, the muscle under his stride moving like a spring wound tight. His right ear bore a notch, a healed scar that gave him a permanent edge. His amber eyes swept the room in silence, sharp and unblinking, before he settled against Jack's leg with a calm alertness. Rex, as the waitress greeted him with a fond grin, was as much a shadow of Jack as the jacket on his back. Jack nodded once at the counter, ordered coffee, and rested his gloves beside him without ceremony. Emily watched him, heart pounding against her ribs, before pulling the envelope from her tote. She approached carefully. "Mr. Miller?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "Jack is fine," he said, glancing at her with a measured calm. He gestured toward Rex. "This is Rex. Best to let him come to you." Emily extended her hand slowly, palm turned down. Rex sniffed, reading the language of her day. Cheap bus coffee, detergent, the faint lemon tang of cleaner. After a pause, he rested his chin lightly on her boot, a gesture of acceptance that loosened the tight knot in her chest. Jack noticed, and the corner of his mouth shifted just enough to suggest approval. They sat together, sharing a plate of eggs and coffee. Jack asked only practical questions. Had she worked with animals before? Could she handle early mornings? Did she have boots that would hold on frozen ground? He did not ask about Tyler, nor about the whispers that clung to her name. Emily answered plainly, grateful for the absence of judgment, her voice steadier with each word. When they left, the wind cut harder across the gravel lot. Jack's truck waited, old and dented, the color of worn pennies. Rex leapt into the back, circling once before pressing his nose to the window. Emily climbed into the cab, the smell of dog and coffee and metal surrounding her. Jack drove in silence, steady hands on the wheel, eyes scanning the road ahead as the land rolled wide and bare. The mailbox marked Miller rose from the dusk, like a signpost to another life. They turned down a gravel drive bordered by cottonwoods, branches rattling in the cold. The house stood weathered but solid, 2 stories of cedar darkened by years of storms, flanked by barns and a corral. A yard light glowed against the dark, casting long shadows across the ground. Jack braked near the porch. Rex jumped down and trotted a perimeter, tail low but wagging once as he passed Emily, as if to say he would guard what she carried into this place. Jack motioned to the door. "You can take the front room for now. We'll settle the rest tomorrow." Emily held her tote close, the strap biting into her shoulder. The doorway spilled warm light across the steps, a boundary drawn between what she had been and what might come. She hesitated, feeling the weight of years of rumors and judgments pressing against her back. Then the wind lifted her hair, and Rex brushed his nose against her calf, a silent reassurance. Emily stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. Behind her, the door closed softly, shutting out the biting night. For the first time in months, she was not a curse, not a rumor, just a woman at the threshold of something new. Chapter 2. Silent Days. The first morning on the ranch came wrapped in silence, a silence so deep it seemed to press against the windows. Emily woke before dawn, the room still dark, the scent of cedar faint in the air. She dressed quickly in the oversized boots from her tote, their stiff soles awkward at first, and followed the faint glow of a yard light out into the bitter air. Frost crusted the ground, crunching beneath each step. The ranch was broad and hushed, fences running toward the horizon, barns hulking in the gloom like sentinels waiting for the sun. She pulled her coat tighter, her breath blooming white, and wondered what she had stepped into. Jack was already outside, as if he had been since midnight. He moved with the economy of a man who had done the same routine for years: check the gates, refill the troughs, haul bales of hay with slow certainty. His shirt was layered under a jacket rubbed pale by weather, and his jaw was shadowed by the same rough beard she had seen the night before. He gave her a nod, not unkind, but not inviting conversation either. "Chickens first," he said simply, then returned to stacking feed. His words were plain instructions, never coated with tone, as though he spoke only what was necessary. Rex padded at his side, black and tan coat catching the weak light, tail sweeping low in rhythm with Jack's steps. The dog watched Emily with a gaze that measured, not hostile but alert, as if cataloging her movements. When she bent to scatter feed, Rex shifted his stance to keep her in view, ears flicking at every sound. He did not bark, but once when a crow landed too close, his lips curled just enough to show white teeth, a silent reminder of his presence. Emily learned quickly that the ranch itself demanded more of her than any spoken word. She cleaned the henhouse, swept the barn aisles, and hauled water until her arms trembled. Her hands, unaccustomed to rough work, soon blistered beneath the gloves she had brought from town. By evening the skin had cracked, small lines of red bright against her pale fingers. She kept them hidden in her pockets, unwilling to show weakness. Jack did not ask how she was managing, but the next morning a pair of new leather gloves appeared on the kitchen table, sized perfectly for her hands. There was no note, no acknowledgement. Emily slipped them on and said nothing. The days bled into one another in a rhythm both exhausting and oddly steady. At dawn she gathered eggs, her breath fogging the air as she crossed the yard. By midday she cooked stew or bread, the warmth of the kitchen a brief reprieve. In the afternoons she scrubbed the porch or carried laundry to the line, watching the wind snap at the cloth like sails. Each task left her sore, but the ache was almost welcome. It meant her body had purpose again. Jack remained a man of few words. His instructions were concise. Stack that by the fence. Check the latch. Bring salt for the trough. Rarely looked at her directly, yet she felt his presence in the smallest gestures. The boots she left by the door were always moved to dry ground if it rained. The kettle was filled before she woke, steam curling softly when she stepped into the kitchen. When she returned late one afternoon from the orchard, cheeks flushed from cold, she found firewood neatly stacked inside, saving her from the bitter wind. Rex's companionship was both unsettling and strangely grounding. At times he shadowed her steps, head low, eyes bright, a constant reminder that she was never unwatched. Once, as she scrubbed the porch until her knees ached, Rex dropped a scuffed rubber ball at her side. She froze, uncertain, then nudged it back with her boot. He barked once, sharp and quick, then carried it away. The next day, the ball appeared outside her bedroom door like an offering. She laughed softly, startled by the sound of her own voice in the quiet house. On her third trip into town for supplies, Emily noticed the way people stared. The store clerk, a woman in her 40s named Carol Jenkins, had a wide smile that never quite reached her eyes. She wore her blonde hair short, tucked behind her ears, and leaned on the counter as she rang up Emily's items. "Miller's got you working out there now?" she asked casually, though her gaze lingered too long. Emily nodded, choosing not to explain. Carol tilted her head. "Hope you last longer than the last one." She did not elaborate, and Emily did not ask. Outside, two older men leaned against a truck, whispering loud enough that she could catch the word unlucky. Her chest tightened, but she kept walking, clutching the sack of flour until her knuckles blanched. When she returned, Jack was repairing a section of fence, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms lined with pale scars. He glanced at the groceries, then at her, eyes steady but unreadable. "Any trouble?" he asked. She shook her head, unwilling to burden him with words she wasn't sure how to frame. He nodded once and returned to his work, driving the nail in with a single sure strike. That night, as the wind rattled the windows, Emily sat at the kitchen table mending one of Jack's shirts. The fabric was rough beneath her fingers, the stitches neat and invisible. She thought of the clerk's words, of the whispers in town, of the way Rex had dropped the ball at her feet, as though to insist she belonged. Jack entered quietly, washed his hands at the sink, and nodded at the shirt. "Good work," he said, two words that carried more weight than praise offered by others. For the first time since stepping onto the ranch, Emily felt a flicker of something warmer than fear. Chapter 3. The Storm and the Truth. The storm rolled in from the west with the weight of a freight train. Clouds piled dark and furious over the plains, the air electric with the promise of rain. Emily had been gathering laundry from the line when the first crack of thunder split the sky, startling the chickens and driving Rex into a sharp bark. The wind whipped the sheets like sails, and by the time she reached the porch, the first fat drops of water were already soaking into the earth. Jack stood by the barn, hammering down a loose board before the gale could rip it free, his shirt clinging to his shoulders under the sudden downpour. He raised a hand in a silent signal, "Get inside," before turning back to his work. But storms in the high country were never just wind and water. They carried chaos with them, throwing branches, frightening horses, pushing trucks too fast along slick roads. Emily barely had time to bring the last sheet inside when she heard shouting beyond the fence line, high-pitched and urgent. She looked toward the narrow county road, the ditch swollen already with runoff, and saw the small figure of a child running across the gravel, arms outstretched, chasing a bright red kite torn free in the wind. The boy was no more than 6, slender with a mop of chestnut hair plastered to his head by rain, his thin jacket flapping behind him like a broken wing. His small boots slipped on the gravel as he stumbled toward the middle of the road, laughing even as thunder cracked overhead. At the top of the hill, a delivery truck barreled forward, its wheels hissing water, the driver leaning on the horn in panic. Emily didn't think. She dropped the laundry in the mud and sprinted, her breath ragged in the wet air, boots pounding against the gravel, her knees scraped raw as she lunged, arms wrapping around the boy's waist, twisting her body to shield him as they rolled into the shallow ditch. The truck roared past, spraying mud and stones, the driver's face pale behind the glass. The red kite whipped into the storm and vanished. For a moment, all Emily could hear was the hammer of her heart and the frightened sobs of the boy pressed against her chest. His knees were scraped, his face wet with both rain and tears. But he was alive. She rocked him gently, murmuring words she hadn't planned. "It's all right. I've got you. You're safe." The kind of comfort that rose from instinct, not choice. A woman came running then, stumbling in the mud, her hair dark with rain. She was in her early 30s, tall and willowy, with long black hair tangled by the storm and eyes the green of new leaves. Her face, though flushed with fear, was striking. High cheekbones, full lips trembling as she called out, "Ethan!" She scooped the boy into her arms, clinging so tight it seemed she would never let go. "Oh God, thank you, she cried, tears mixing with the rain as she looked at Emily with raw gratitude. This was Sarah Whitmore, a widow known in town for her quiet strength. She had lost her husband 2 winters ago in a grain silo accident, a tragedy that left her raising their only son alone. Since then, she had been cautious, protective, often keeping to herself. But in that moment, all she could do was clutch her son and choke back sobs. The people who had gathered under shop awnings and behind car doors whispered loudly enough to be heard even over the rain. "Isn't that the Miller woman? The unlucky one? Who'd have thought she'd throw herself into the road like that?" Some laughed nervously. Others stared, as if trying to reconcile rumor with what their eyes had seen. Rex appeared then, soaked to the bone, fur plastered against his powerful frame, barking furiously at the retreating truck, then circling back to Emily, tail thrashing, his amber eyes wide with alarm. He pressed against her legs, licking at her scraped hands, his body forming a shield between her and the crowd. Jack had seen everything from the far side of the fence. He came at a steady pace, rain dripping from his hair, his shirt plastered against his broad chest. He didn't rush, didn't call out, just stood near enough for Emily to see that he had witnessed it all. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held something firm, something unspoken. By the time the storm passed and the townsfolk scattered, Emily returned to the ranch mud-stained and shivering, her knees burning from scrapes. Jack said nothing as he handed her a towel at the door. Rex followed her close, refusing to leave her side until she had changed into dry clothes. That night, after the lamps were out and silence had settled over the house, Emily found something outside her door, a small wooden carving of a dog, its ears pricked, its stance protective. The wood was rough but carefully shaped, the lines etched with patience. There was no note, no explanation, but she knew whose hands had carved it. She held it for a long time, the simple figure resting in her palms. It was not just a gift. It was a statement. Jack had seen, Jack had understood. She was not cursed, not unlucky, not the woman whispered about in pews and shops. She was someone who ran into the storm, who saved a child, who was brave even when her knees bled. And in that silent acknowledgement carved from cedar, Emily felt the truth settle. Whatever the town might say, she had begun to carve a place for herself here too. Chapter 4. The news that changed everything. The weeks after the storm carried a strange quiet, as though the land itself had paused to take measure of Emily's place upon it. She worked each day with a steadier rhythm, her hands calloused but more certain, her movements less hesitant. Yet beneath the growing routine lay an exhaustion she could not quite explain. One afternoon, as she carried a heavy bucket across the yard, the sky tilted and the ground rose toward her. She collapsed in the dirt, vision gone white. Rex was the first to react. The German shepherd, his coat gleaming black and tan in the cold light, bounded to her side, whining sharply and pawing at her sleeve. Jack heard the dog's urgent cry and crossed the yard at a run. He lifted Emily gently, his arms strong and careful, his face taut with concern, though his words remained few. "We're going," he said, his voice steady but firm, and helped her into the old truck. The drive into town was quiet save for the hum of the engine and the soft tune Jack whistled under his breath, perhaps to soothe her, perhaps to steady himself. They stopped at the small clinic near Main Street, a modest brick building with a faded sign. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and paper, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. Dr. Michael Rowe greeted them, a man in his mid-40s with graying hair cropped short, a neatly trimmed beard, and the calm demeanor of someone who had seen both joy and despair in equal measure. His shoulders were broad, his eyes kind behind wire-rimmed glasses, and his voice carried the quiet authority of years of practice. Known in town as a doctor who never rushed his patients, Michael had returned home after a residency in Denver, preferring the pace of small-town medicine where every face was familiar. He examined Emily with patience, asking questions without judgment, pressing gently at her stomach, listening with a stethoscope cool against her skin. At last he looked up with a smile that softened the room. "You're not ill, Mrs. Parker," he said warmly. "You're pregnant. About 8 weeks, if I'm correct." The words fell like stones into a still pond. Emily blinked, unable to grasp them at first. For years she had carried the curse of being called barren, cursed, unlucky. Tears welled in her eyes, not of joy but of fear. The memory of every whisper, every accusation, every time she had been told she was incapable. Her lips trembled. "It can't be," she whispered. "What if it's wrong? What if I lose it?" Jack, who had stood silently at her side, knelt slightly, his large hand closing gently over hers. His thumb brushed against her knuckles, rough calluses warm against her skin. "If you can't believe it yet," he said quietly, "then let me believe for both of us. Until you're ready." His words were not grand, but steady, like fence posts sunk deep into soil. Emily wept then, not the bitter tears of old shame, but the trembling sobs of someone finally allowed to feel possibility. Dr. Rowe excused himself, giving them space, and when Emily finally calmed, she held Jack's gaze for longer than she ever had, seeing in his silence the strength she had lacked for herself. But news traveled fast in small towns. Within days, whispers turned into speculation, speculation into gossip. By the following Sunday, the rumor had spread to the very people who had cast her out. Late in the afternoon, a wagon rolled hard into the ranch, followed by a truck carrying familiar faces. From the cab stepped Marlon Trask, Emily's ex-husband, thinner than she remembered. His once proud shoulders slouched, his eyes refusing to meet hers. Behind him came his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Trask, dressed in their best Sunday coats, as though righteousness required ceremony. Mrs. Trask, a sharp-featured woman with graying hair tied into a bun, was quick to speak. Her voice carried like broken glass across the yard. "So this is where you've been hiding, spreading lies about miracles that don't exist. You never could carry life, and you never will. Her husband, broad-shouldered with a face weathered by years in the fields, nodded grimly, though his eyes darted uneasily toward Jack. Emily stood on the porch, knuckles white around the railing, her body trembling but her gaze unbroken. Rex moved instantly, placing himself at her side, his ears pricked, his low growl vibrating like distant thunder. Jack stepped forward, his presence calm but unyielding, holding a folded document in his hand. "This is a medical confirmation," he said evenly, his voice clear enough for the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered near the gate. "Dr. Rowe has certified that Emily is nearly 3 months pregnant." He paused, letting the words settle, his eyes steady on the Trasks. "The woman you called useless, cursed, a disgrace. She is carrying life. Perhaps the blame never belonged where you placed it." Gasps rippled among the onlookers. Mrs. Trask went pale, her sharpness faltering for once. Mr. Trask's jaw tightened, but no words came. Marlin still would not meet Emily's eyes, his face drawn, shame creeping across him like a shadow. Rex barked then, sharp and fierce, stepping closer to the gate as though daring anyone to cross. His tail stood high, his body rigid, a living barrier between Emily and those who had wronged her. The effect was clear. The Trasks turned back toward their wagon, climbing in without further argument, leaving in a cloud of dust that seemed smaller than the one they had arrived with. Emily's chest heaved with emotion, but Jack's steady presence beside her kept her rooted. He did not touch her in front of the crowd, but his silence spoke louder than anger. The truth had been laid bare, and for the first time in years, the weight shifted from her shoulders to where it belonged. That evening, the house was quiet save for the crackle of the fire. Emily sat at the table, the gloves Jack had given her resting on the wood, the wooden carving of Rex still on her nightstand upstairs. The storm outside had passed, but the storm within her heart had begun to ease. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she was not defined by curses or whispers, but by courage, by resilience, and by the life growing inside her. Chapter 5. Autumn and the Choice. The air carried the scent of apples and wood smoke, a promise of harvest and the slow turning of the year. The small town had dressed itself for the autumn festival, strings of lanterns swaying across Main Street, tables lined with pies, roasted meats, and jars of preserves. Children darted between stalls with painted faces, chasing each other through piles of leaves that vendors had swept aside. Music drifted from a fiddler posted by the grain mill, the notes quick and bright against the cooling air. For the first time since her arrival, Emily Parker walked into town without her shoulders bowed. She wore a pale blue dress that Jack had bought on their last trip. Simple cotton, but it softened her figure and brushed gently against the small swell of her belly. Her auburn hair was pulled into a loose braid, and though whispers still followed her, she no longer shrank beneath them. Beside her walked Jack Miller, broad-shouldered in a dark jacket, his beard trimmed but still rugged, his eyes steady as ever. His hand rested lightly on the small of her back, not to guide but to assure. At his side, Rex trotted proudly, tail raised, the polished leather of his collar gleaming in the lantern light. Children darted close to stroke his ears, and the shepherd accepted them with quiet dignity, though his gaze flicked always back to Emily, never abandoning his watch. The festival had drawn faces both familiar and new. Among them was Reverend Thomas Hale, a tall man in his 60s with snow-white hair, a lined face, and eyes that held both compassion and the weight of judgment learned over decades. His black coat and crisp white collar lent him presence, though his voice was gentle when he greeted Emily. "Good evening, Mrs. Parker," he said, his deep baritone carrying sincerity. Once cautious around her, tonight his nod held a measure of respect. Near the cider stand, Sarah Whitmore waved, her long black hair loose about her shoulders, her son Ethan clutching a carved wooden toy. Sarah's green eyes shone with warmth. Since the storm, she had been one of the few openly kind to Emily, and tonight she smiled broadly. "You look beautiful," she said, brushing Emily's arm. Emily flushed, murmured her thanks, touched by the simple affirmation. But not all gazes were friendly. Carol Jenkins, the store clerk with her short blonde hair and sly eyes, stood with two other women by the fabric stall. Their voices were pitched just low enough to feign discretion. "Strange, isn't it?" one murmured. "A barren woman carrying now? Fortune changes too fast sometimes." Carol smirked, sipping cider. Yet even she faltered when Jack's shadow fell near, his expression unreadable but heavy with warning. As twilight deepened, lanterns were lit, casting golden pools of light across the square. A hush spread when Jack stepped onto the small wooden stage erected for speeches. He looked neither rehearsed nor nervous, only deliberate, the same calm he brought to the ranch, now turned toward the crowd. He let his gaze sweep over them, neighbors who had whispered, merchants who had judged, farmers who had turned their backs, and then his voice carried, steady and clear. "They called her unlucky," he began, his tone without anger, only truth. "They said she was cursed, that no good could come of her presence. But since the day Emily Parker set foot on my land, I have seen nothing but courage. She works until her hands bleed, and still she rises before the sun. When a child ran into the storm, she didn't hesitate. She ran into the road and saved his life. If that is misfortune, then may God grant me more of it." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Emily stood frozen, her throat tight, her hands trembling against the folds of her dress. Jack stepped down from the stage then, his boots striking the boards with quiet finality. He walked straight to her, stopping before the lantern-lit circle where everyone could see. He lowered himself onto one knee, not in ceremony, not with a jeweler's ring, but with a hand pressed against his chest. His gray eyes met hers, unflinching. "Emily," he said, voice low enough for her, yet carrying through the hush. "I don't offer you riches or polished promises. I offer you my days, my steadiness, and whatever strength I've got left. If you'll have me, I want to walk the rest of the road with you." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then Rex barked once, sharp and jubilant, his tail wagging furiously. Children laughed and clapped, their small voices breaking the tension. The townsfolk exchanged looks, some uneasy, others softened, as if a stone had shifted inside them. Emily's vision blurred with tears, but her smile broke free, trembling and radiant. She nodded once, then again, her voice choked but certain. "Yes." She reached for Jack's hand, pulling him up. They did not kiss, not here, not before so many. But the way their eyes locked, it was more intimate than any touch could be. Around them, the square filled with applause, hesitant at first, then swelling as lanterns swayed in the wind. And in that moment, Emily understood. She had found her place. Not in whispered curses, not in exile, but in this man's steady belief, in the loyalty of a dog who never left her side, in the child stirring quietly within her. She was no longer defined by the shadows others had cast. She was, at last, her own. Chapter 5. Autumn and the Choice. The air carried the scent of apples and wood smoke, a promise of harvest and the slow turning of the year. The small town had dressed itself for the autumn festival, strings of lanterns swaying across Main Street, tables lined with pies, roasted meats, and jars of preserves. Children darted between stalls with painted faces, chasing each other through piles of leaves that vendors had swept aside. Music drifted from a fiddler posted by the grain mill, the notes quick and bright against the cooling air. For the first time since her arrival, Emily Parker walked into town without her shoulders bowed. She wore a pale blue dress that Jack had bought on their last trip. Simple cotton, but it softened her figure and brushed gently against the small swell of her belly. Her auburn hair was pulled into a loose braid, and though whispers still followed her, she no longer shrank beneath them. Beside her walked Jack Miller, broad-shouldered in a dark jacket, his beard trimmed but still rugged, his eyes steady as ever. His hand rested lightly on the small of her back, not to guide but to assure. At his side Rex trotted proudly, tail raised, the polished leather of his collar gleaming in the lantern light. Children darted close to stroke his ears, and the shepherd accepted them with quiet dignity, though his gaze flicked always back to Emily, never abandoning his watch. The festival had drawn faces both familiar and new. Among them was Reverend Thomas Hale, a tall man in his 60s with snow-white hair, a lined face, and eyes that held both compassion and the weight of judgment learned over decades. His black coat and crisp white collar lent him presence, though his voice was gentle when he greeted Emily. "Good evening, Mrs. Parker," he said, his deep baritone carrying sincerity. Once cautious around her, tonight his nod held a measure of respect. Near the cider stand, Sarah Whitmore waved, her long black hair loose about her shoulders, her son Ethan clutching a carved wooden toy. Sarah's green eyes shone with warmth. Since the storm, she had been one of the few openly kind to Emily, and tonight she smiled broadly. "You look beautiful," she said, brushing Emily's arm. Emily, flushed, murmured her thanks, touched by the simple affirmation. But not all gazes were friendly. Carol Jenkins, the store clerk with her short blonde hair and sly eyes, stood with two other women by the fabric stall. Their voices were pitched just low enough to feign discretion. "Strange, isn't it?" one murmured. "A barren woman carrying now? Fortune changes too fast sometimes." Carol smirked, sipping cider. Yet even she faltered when Jack's shadow fell near, his expression unreadable but heavy with warning. As twilight deepened, lanterns were lit, casting golden pools of light across the square. A hush spread when Jack stepped onto the small wooden stage erected for speeches. He looked neither rehearsed nor nervous, only deliberate, the same calm he brought to the ranch, now turned toward the crowd. He let his gaze sweep over them. Neighbors who had whispered, merchants who had judged, farmers who had turned their backs. And then his voice carried, steady and clear. "They called her unlucky," he began, his tone without anger, only truth. "They said she was cursed, that no good could come of her presence. But since the day Emily Parker set foot on my land, I have seen nothing but courage. She works until her hands bleed, and still she rises before the sun. When a child ran into the storm, she didn't hesitate. She ran into the road and saved his life. If that is misfortune, then may God grant me more of it." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Emily stood frozen, her throat tight, her hands trembling against the folds of her dress. Jack stepped down from the stage then, his boots striking the boards with quiet finality. He walked straight to her, stopping before the lantern-lit circle where everyone could see. He lowered himself onto one knee, not in ceremony, not with a jeweler's ring, but with a hand pressed against his chest. His gray eyes met hers, unflinching. "Emily," he said, voice low enough for her, yet carrying through the hush. "I don't offer you riches or polished promises. I offer you my days, my steadiness, and whatever strength I've got left. If you'll have me, I want to walk the rest of the road with you." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then Rex barked once, sharp and jubilant, his tail wagging furiously. Children laughed and clapped, their small voices breaking the tension. The townsfolk exchanged looks, some uneasy, others softened, as if a stone had shifted inside them. Emily's vision blurred with tears, but her smile broke free, trembling and radiant. She nodded once, then again, her voice choked but certain. "Yes." She reached for Jack's hand, pulling him up. They did not kiss, not here, not before so many, but the way their eyes locked, it was more intimate than any touch could be. Around them, the square filled with applause, hesitant at first, then swelling as lanterns swayed in the wind. And in that moment, Emily understood. She had found her place. Not in whispered curses, not in exile, but in this man's steady belief, in the loyalty of a dog who never left her side, in the child stirring quietly within her. She was no longer defined by the shadows others had cast. She was, at last, her own.